Deep within the Arctic Circle lies the most dangerous place you could think of to sail a ship. It is a maze of islands and drifting ice, where channels open without warning and close again as fast. Nature here, one sailor wrote, is like a living, malevolent beast. This ice maze stretches for 1,000 miles across the Canadian Arctic, and finding a route across it, the fabled Northwest Passage, was the holy grail of exploration for more than 400 years. But of all the hundreds of attempts, 2 are legends in themselves. The first, led by Sir John Franklin, was the climax of Victorian Britain's passion for conquest, as arrogant and heroic as any expedition in history. The second, led by the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, was a penniless venture in a tiny second-hand fishing boat. But so revolutionary, it tore up the rulebook of exploration. Both men would pay a devastating price in their battle with the ice maze. In the spring of 1845, the largest and most lavishly supplied expedition ever to sail in search of the Northwest Passage headed towards the Arctic, certain that this prize was theirs for the taking. But the fate of this expedition was to become one of the most enduring mysteries of British history. It was last sighted heading for the ice. Then the 2 ships and 129 men simply vanished off the face of the earth. More than 40 search expeditions scoured the Arctic in the decade that followed, but no survivors were ever found, nor any trace of their ships. Only now, more than 150 years later, has a group of scientists and historians uncovered an extraordinary new trail of clues.
It's really one of the most remarkable bodies of evidence we have from eyewitnesses who actually saw what happened.
I think this evidence is strongly suggestive of cannibalism among these Franklin crew members.
Was a feeling of shock, really, or amazement that these sailors from the last century, there they were.
Based on this evidence, these experts will try to reconstruct the last journey of Franklin and his men. The search for the Northwest Passage dated back to the 16th century. Some of the greatest names in exploration, men like Hudson and Frobisher, each tried and failed to find a route through the ice. The dream they were chasing was a trade route that would link Europe and Asia, not by the long route round the Horn, but by sailing a ship across the Arctic. The problem was just that it was probably the most dangerous shortcut in the world. The Arctic is an archipelago of islands with ice in between, and the ice is constantly moving.
It's a puzzle, it's a matrix, like a maze. The winds are blowing the ice around, the currents are pushing the ice. And for a ship to traverse that was next to impossible. The ice floes are grinding together. They would open up and make a nice open water lead, and a ship would sail down it. And suddenly the wind shifts, the ice closes in on them, and they're trapped. They can't go backwards, they can't go forwards.
For 300 years, the ice defeated every challenger. But then, in 1845, a nation that had conquered half the globe refused to accept that this stubborn piece of wilderness could defeat them. A new British voyage in search of the passage was announced, under the command of Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old former polar explorer, hoping for one last shot at glory before retirement. His expedition was to be the best funded and best equipped in the history of the passage. A showcase of the Victorians' ability to master nature with technology.
They're not doing this in a threadbare way. They're doing this in the most abundant, well-provisioned, lavish, confident, mid-Victorian way that you could possibly imagine.
Franklin's ships, the Erebus and the Terror, were supplied with the very latest inventions. Tin cans to keep their meat supplies fresh, boilers to heat their cabins, iron plates to protect their hulls, and 15-ton locomotive engines to part even the thickest ice.
You can sense the extraordinary confidence of people who'd pushed back the frontiers of nature through the glories of the Industrial Revolution, this might that they suddenly had at their disposal. And so they built up this force and 2 great ships reinforced by steel, and this would be their fortress.
As the ship set sail, the Times reported, "With all the advantages of modern science, the expedition may be attended with great results." The possibility of failure was barely discussed.
In the 40 years before the Franklin expedition, they haven't had a disaster yet. They've come very close to disaster, but almost dying has a nasty habit of actually confirming you in your ways. It makes you proud of yourself for having survived.
A month later, the ship stopped at Greenland to load final supplies. Though Franklin hoped to make it across the Arctic that summer, he was equipped to spend 3 winters in the ice. And that was the sting to the passage. Explorers not only had to navigate a 1,000-mile labyrinth of ice and land, they had to do it against the clock, in the 3 short months of summer when channels opened through the ice.
See, you're writing to that woman of yours again, James.
No, I'm writing to my brother's wife.
Ah, of course. I seem to have touched a nerve.
On board the ships, Franklin seemed to inspire both trust and devotion.
Yeah, I touched.
James Fitzjames, a young officer on the Erebus, was on his first voyage to the Arctic.
You have no idea how happy we all feel. We are very fond of Sir John. He is anything but nervous and fidgety. He is full of life and energy and kindness. We will toast his health when we reach the other side. Everyone believes we will make it through in a season, though I hope that we are forced to stay at least 1 winter in the ice.
But not everyone shared this confidence. Francis Crozier, the expedition's second-in-command, saw aspects of Franklin that made him distinctly nervous.
All goes smoothly, but I am sad and alone. I don't have a soul in either ship that I can go and talk to. No congenial spirit, as it were. Franklin is very decided in his own views, but has not got good judgment. I fear we will blunder into the ice.
On the 28th of July, 1845, the expedition passed a British whaling ship as they headed for the ice. The captain reported the men were in remarkable spirits, expecting to finish the operation in good time. It was the last undisputed sighting of Franklin and his men alive. Something happened to that expedition within the ice maze. Something that seemed to pluck them from the face of the earth. How could the largest and best equipped expedition in Arctic history simply disappear? It is a mystery that's become an obsession for men like historian Russell Potter. Potter has come to the Arctic on the trail of clues that might reconstruct the path of the expedition. Over the past 150 years, the snow and ice have gradually given up fragments of evidence, and the first are here, near the Inuit settlement of Resolute.
It's one of the most tremendously haunting stories, maybe the greatest unsolved mystery of the 19th century. 2 ships, 129 men. Where have they gone? There's evidence scattered almost all over this map. You have some graves here, a whaleboat here, skeletons on the beach here. So it's about as close as you can get to the feeling of actually being in the path of the Franklin expedition.
The first clue to the route Franklin took when he reached the ice lies at a site 4 hours skidoo ride north of Resolute. It was evidence of a winter camp, and it was first discovered 5 years after the expedition disappeared.
The searchers found the first traces of the Franklin expedition here on Beechey Island. They found signs that tents had been erected, a place where a smithy or anvil had been set up, even some attempt to build a garden up on the shingle.
But the most telling relics of all were the graves of 3 of Franklin's young sailors.
Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Sitting here with these graves, we know they were here. It's just a very, very haunting and haunted place.
The camp at Beechey Island was 300 miles into the Arctic ice, and was proof at least that Franklin and his men had survived their first taste of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth.
It was magical in a terrifying way. It was as big a thing for them as it would be for us to send somebody now to walk on Mars. It was that unsupported. It was that much at the far limit of what human beings could do.
As the dark of Arctic winter set in, the expedition must have sought the shelter of Beechey Island. There, they were perfectly equipped to spend their first winter frozen in the ice. They had a library of 3,000 books, heated cabins, even provisions supplied by Fortnum and Mason.
They were clutching their civilization closely around them, and they thought it made them safe. They thought that was all they would need.
It was a whole mentality, a siege mentality. The ship was there to keep out all the elements, and as long as that ship maintained itself, as long as they cut off the outside world, they would be absolutely fine.
But for such a well-equipped expedition, the evidence at Beechey was also troubling. Why did 3 young sailors die so soon after leaving England? And why, beside the graves, were hundreds of empty tinned food cans piled into a tower, with no message or explanation?
It was strict naval protocol to leave a written document of some kind at every location, but no matter where they looked here on Beechey, there was nothing. They found other signs, though, that may point to a hasty departure. There was a pair of cashmere gloves left drying on a rock, bits and pieces of things as if people had left in a hurry. But the only sign was a boarding pike, been left on the beach with a pointing hand painted on a board nailed to it. Where it pointed, nobody was quite sure.
The winter camp at Beechey was a tantalizing first discovery, but it offered a glimpse of the expedition and nothing more. No one knew where Franklin's men had gone from there. After the discovery of Franklin's winter camp, the trail of the missing expedition went cold, until the next clue was discovered in 1859, 14 years after the expedition disappeared. It was found 350 miles south of the winter camp at Beechey, on the northern tip of King William Island. Pulled from a tower of stones, it was an expedition log sealed inside a metal canister.
The evidence we have is a small record piece of Admiralty paper in a metal cylinder inside a cairn. It began with the standard Admiralty form, the message, "All well, Sir John Franklin commanding."
The expedition log reported that, in the autumn of 1846, just months after leaving Beechey Island, the ships were trapped in ice.
But around that message in the margins was written a second, far more disturbing message.
Scribbled in the margin 2 years later, this message said the ships were still trapped, and now they were being deserted. It was the only piece of written evidence ever found, and it provided vital clues. First, it revealed where Franklin's ship sailed from Beechey. Just as he was instructed, Franklin sailed south towards an area uncharted on his map, and from there, down an unmarked channel known today as Peel Sound.
Now, Peel Sound heads straight south. To Franklin, that would have been a very, very tempting route to take, particularly if it was open, free of ice. And Peel Sound, we know today, is very, very changeable from year to year. One year it can be completely wide open, another year it can be choked up with ice so that it's impassable even by modern ships.
But if this channel was a tempting route, it was also a dangerous one. No previous expedition had ever reported Peel Sound to be navigable.
How is the current? Anything from Ross? Anything in Parry?
Franklin had already broken naval protocol by failing to leave a note at Beechey Island. Now, he was ordering his ships down a channel the Admiralty assumed was impassable. On HMS Terror, his second-in-command, Francis Crozier, must have mulled the letter he'd written from Greenland.
Franklin is very decided in his own views, but has not got good judgment. I fear we will blunder into the ice.
In the summer of 1846, Franklin led his ships into Peel Sound.
And may God protect us.
At first, it seemed they made good progress, traveling 300 miles south to where the expedition log was found. But there, at the bottom of Peel Sound, the ice closed in. In the log, it documented the nightmare that then unfolded. They were trapped in the ice at the same position, not just for the winter of 1846, but all through the spring and summer of 1847, waiting in vain for the ice to break up.
The nightmare scenario is that I'm never going to get out of this ice. I'm facing another long winter. It's going to get dark. It's going to get very cold. And here I am out on the ice that's still moving around. I don't know where this ice is carrying me.
Something terrifying was unfolding that summer. Something that undermined every aspect of their plan. The ice wasn't melting. Back in the town of Resolute, this odd aspect of the mystery sparked the curiosity of a polar ice scientist. Roy Kerner knew that if he could unravel the weather conditions Franklin encountered, it might solve this piece of the puzzle. But first, he needed ice preserved from the mid-19th century. Out on the Arctic ice cap, his team drilled for an ice core that by its depth they could date to the 1840s, and then Kerner began looking for clues.
The reason ice cores give the history of the climate in the past is that everything that happens in the surface is preserved as the ice gets buried. If the surface of the snow melts, the water percolates down and it forms these ice layers. The more it melts, the more ice layers and the thicker the ice layers.
But on the Franklin ice core, there was simply no sign of the transparent ice layers that showed the snow was melting.
The point to make on this core is the absolute near absence of any signs of melting whatsoever. None of those clear layers at all. Just bubbly ice that is formed from compression of snow that doesn't melt in the summer.
Kerner had once seen another ice core with this little evidence of summer melting back in the early 1970s. Then his records revealed a very cold period of almost permanent winter, when much of the sea ice simply didn't melt at all. It convinced him that Franklin had collided with the most dangerous ice conditions imaginable.
If it's a cold summer, that ice isn't going to go out and open up. The channels are ice infested still. Some modern icebreakers can plow through quite thick ice without even stopping. But if you're talking the ships that they used in those days, it's a totally different situation. They don't have the power to get through even modest ice.
Kerner's evidence explained why the ships weren't released in the summer of 1847, but worse, suggested this cold period might have lasted as many as 5 years. And just as the men began to realize their predicament, something else happened. The expedition log contained a second devastating message. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. The total loss by death in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men.
They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul melteth away because of trouble. They reel to and fro, and stagger like a drunken man.
It's clear from everything we know he was a beloved commander.
Then they cry,
He'd been in the Arctic before and only one other officer had.
and he bringeth them out.
I think that his presence was a tremendous reassurance to everyone there, and his loss would have been a terrific blow.
So that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad, because they are quiet. So he bringeth them unto the haven where they would be.
In the year Franklin died, his wife, Lady Jane, felt a strange sense of foreboding. Unaware that she was already a widow, she wrote a series of letters to her missing husband.
I desire nothing but to cherish the remainder of your days, however injured and broken your health may be. I live in you, my dearest.
Franklin and 23 of his men died just 2 years into one of the best supplied expeditions in Arctic history. But why was one of the biggest mysteries of all.
We don't know what it was that was killing them. It's a huge loss, unparalleled in any other expedition of this kind. Terrific casualties, and yet the note doesn't tell us what was killing them.
The first clue to what might be causing the deaths wasn't discovered until 1984, when the Canadian government gave permission for a team of forensic scientists to exhume the graves of the 3 sailors buried at Beechey Island.
At Beechey Island, you have the remains of 3 members of the expedition, and almost certainly preserved remains, so that this opens the possibility of understanding the medical reasons behind the disaster.
The team believed the corpses would lie preserved in the ice, but nothing prepared them for what they uncovered.
It It was such a profoundly moving experience, and also one of shock, really, or amazement that these sailors from the last century, there they were. You could see their eyelashes, you could see their eye color, you could even get a sense almost of the personality of these characters.
After the autopsy in the Arctic, the bodies of the Franklin sailors were reburied, and the team returned to their laboratory in Canada to continue the investigation. It was there, as they began to run forensic tests on the sailors' hair and soft tissue, that they discovered something intriguing. Levels of lead 6 to 10 times normal, enough to cause severe lead poisoning. But what had caused it? The question drew the scientists back to another of the clues at Beechey Island, the Tower of Tin Food Cans. When they tested the lead in the soldering of the cans, it matched the lead found in the bodies.
It's like a fingerprint that was found in the bodies, in the organs, in the tissues, in the bone, that was also found in the solder. It came from the tin food supply, and that was the smoking gun.
Not everyone was convinced. Some scientists argued the lead levels could have been caused by the industrial pollution of Victorian Britain. But then in the 1990s, a Canadian anthropologist decided to test the evidence from a new angle. Using a process called X-ray fluorescence, she discovered the indications of lead were much higher in soft, spongy bones like the vertebrae than any other bones in the body. It was a vital clue, because soft bones virtually regenerate themselves every few years.
These individuals were exposed to this lead over a fairly recent period of time before their death. So this was short-term exposure from some source on the expedition.
Above all, Keenly-Side's tests confirmed the extraordinary levels of lead in the bodies.
They were so high that these individuals would have almost certainly been suffering from serious physiological and neurological problems.
The symptoms would include fatigue, confusion, and paranoia. In itself, the lead might not kill the men, but if they were sick already, it could. The surgeons might never have guessed, though, that their ingenious tin food supply was the very thing poisoning the men.
Suddenly you have a picture that suggests that the technology that Franklin had hoped to see them through actually played a role in their destructions. There was something that was undermining the health of the crews.
With men sickening, the ships trapped, their commander dead, and supplies running low, the crew's situation was growing desperate. The expedition log gave one last clue as to what happened next. It said 105 men were deserting the ships and making for a place called Back's Fish River. But Back's Fish River was the other side of a channel they might need boats to cross. And after that, it was a further 90 miles to the river. By any standard, it was a momentous decision. They were abandoning the shelter and safety of the ships for the Arctic wilderness around them.
Given the shortage of provisions and the circumstances of the ships, it was probably an unavoidable choice. The ship is a kind of a womb, it's a kind of a place of safety, but eventually your refuge is going to be your tomb.
The expedition log was signed by the officer now in command, Francis Crozier, the man who feared Franklin would blunder into the ice. But if Crozier judged Franklin, he now faced an even bigger test himself. The ships were stranded 600 miles from the nearest civilization, and no one at the Admiralty had ever anticipated that the men would need to travel by foot across the harshest landscape on Earth. In 1859, the search party that found the expedition log also came across an abandoned boat. Together with its heavy oak sled, the boat weighed 1,400 pounds. But it was what was inside that shocked the searchers most.
This boatload of strange relics of Victorian culture. The Vicar of Wakefield prayer books, New Testament in French, carpet slippers, chocolate, tea, button polishers, buttons, silver plate and utensils, all of the detritus of this, inner culture of the ships that they tried to take with them.
I can imagine these people desperately wanting to carry their precious world with them, but everything they trusted was now going to become not an advantage, but a problem, so that they were burdened now by their numbers, they were burdened now by the weight of their stores, and above all, burdened by the fact that they didn't know what to do with the land that they were now suddenly totally dependent on.
The expedition log said 105 men started walking south in May 1848. After that, the clues ran dry. No other messages were ever discovered. But there was just one last lead. The possibility that out in the Arctic, there were eyewitnesses who'd seen these men alive. For more than a century, it was assumed that the Franklin survivors who deserted the ships in 1848 died of sickness and starvation on their journey south that year. But that ignored one fascinating possibility, that there were eyewitnesses in the Arctic to the fate of these men. Hidden in a Washington archive for more than 100 years were detailed accounts of Inuit people encountering Franklin's men. The testimony, studied by Russell Potter, was given to an explorer called Francis Hall in the 1860s. But it was discarded because the Victorians believed the Inuit were ignorant savages.
I think that the evidence he brought back was just evidence people did not want to hear. I mean, for more than a century, people ignored that evidence. The vague babble of savages, they called it. Inuit testimony couldn't be trustworthy. They couldn't have known. But he was incredibly diligent. He went and lived among them. He gathered information carefully. He asked people again and again the same questions, corroborated the testimony. It's really one of the most remarkable bodies of evidence we have, from eyewitnesses who actually saw what happened.
The first intriguing clue amongst the Inuit evidence told of an abandoned camp on King William Island.
The story recurred of a camp, a tent place, as Hall called it, where there was some sign of a permanent camp. There were bodies, there was equipment. The Inuit had been there and brought things out of it. And eventually he had eyewitnesses who had been there, who had seen the tent.
The presence of a camp, where men had spent some time, suggested that something had brought the expedition's journey south to a halt that summer. In the expedition log, Crozier said they were making for Baxfish River, a 250-mile journey south. But this camp, found by the Inuit, was barely 80 miles south of the ships. No one knows why they might have abandoned the journey south. But it's possible the sickness amongst the men was getting worse, and that 3 years into their Arctic journey, a new factor was at work: scurvy. The expedition was issued lemon juice to stave off the disease. But vitamin C is highly unstable. As early as a year into their journey, their supplies were probably useless.
The first symptoms of scurvy are a general lassitude and a weakness, and it mainly affects the gums. They become swollen, they become purple. The slightest touch means they bleed very, very easily. As it develops, the bleeding goes on everywhere. You can get bleeding into your eyes, you get bleeding into your muscles, and this is particularly painful. The main muscle that you're using to try and pull this sledge through the snow, and you've got this agonizing bleeding into the muscles and into the joints, so it would have just slowly but horrendously killed them.
When you combine lead and scurvy, you suddenly have this tag team undermining the health of the crewmen. It really was a recipe for a mass disaster.
As the winter of 1848 approached, Crozier and his second-in-command, James Fitzjames, the young officer on his first voyage to the Arctic, must have realized their chances of walking off the island were gone. There was just one tentative clue to the decision they made. When the search party found the boat full of possessions abandoned, one of the searchers noticed a strange detail.
Having surveyed the site, he notices the boat, and it is actually pointed in what seems to him the wrong direction. It's not going away from where the ships were abandoned, it's going back. These were not people who were going somewhere in expectation of release. They were retreating back to the only home that they knew and trying desperately to get there.
Franklin's men were now facing their fourth winter in the Arctic. As they retreated back to the ships that autumn of 1848, the first British Admiralty search party was making its way into the Arctic. That winter, it even sent a sledging party right to the mouth of Peel Sound, the very channel south that Franklin's ships had sailed down.
When the searchers came looking for him, they looked down Peel Sound and saw nothing but an impassable barrier of ice. Just assumed, I guess, that Peel Sound was always choked with ice. It never opened up, that Franklin never would have gone down there.
The search party moved on and reported Franklin must have gone another way. Just 300 miles to the south, Franklin's men, back in the shelter of their ships, must have believed their chances of rescue were fading. If they were going to get out, it would have to be on their own. Buried in the Washington archives, there was now an Inuit report of some of Franklin's men trying for a second time to walk to safety. Two elderly Inuit, called Takita and Oa, described the encounter to explorer Charles Hall. They said the year was 1850, and that the men were led by an officer.
We were out sealing when we saw something on the ice. As they drew nearer, we realized it was white men. They asked us for food.
Can you help us? We need food. Yes, we're very hungry, yes?
The officer also signaled that two ships lay in the ice to the north.
Ships?
Then he made a motion of falling sideways, whistling and blowing. It was the sound of a ship being crushed in the ice.
The Inuit said they gave the men some seal meat, which they took back to their tents. They also said the men only seemed able to shoot small birds. They needed food because they didn't know how to catch seals or hunt caribou.
Early next morning, we set off. The leader tried to make us stop, but we were in a hurry and did not know the men were starving.
Stop! Stop! Stop!
Inuit simply packed up and left. But when you think about it, a group of 30 white men, all hungry, emaciated, starving, unable to hunt for themselves, unable to move quickly, and a small band of Inuit, maybe only 2 or 3 hunters. There's no way they could have kept that large group alive. And if they had tried, it probably would have resulted in the death of both groups.
The story of what happened to those men is told in a trail of remains discovered over the years along the south coast of King William Island. At first they managed to bury their dead in makeshift graves, but then, weakened by coldness and hunger, they simply died where they fell. The bodies scattered at intervals for 30 miles.
In the Arctic, you feel like the elements are not passive. You feel like you're involved in some malevolent force. When you experience extreme cold for the first time, it's like a glove closing around you. You feel like you don't want to fight, you want to give in, you want to close down your senses. After a time, it's almost as if the cold has seeped through to your heart. And I don't mean your physical heart, I mean your soul, your very being, because you feel like no longer fighting. And once you've given up that fight, and you just want to sleep, you just want to become part of that oblivion.
Then they cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distress. He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still. Then are they glad, because they are quiet.
The men who died trying to reach help told the Inuit that one of their ships had been crushed in the ice. That same year, the Inuit described an incident that took place on a single ship trapped in the ice. And this was the most disturbing story of all, an account of one last group of survivors. An elderly woman reported that a man from her village came upon a ship with a camp on land nearby.
The Inuit went to the ship all alone. He said there were men there. He said they had black faces, black hands, black clothes on, were black all over. This Inuit was very alarmed because they would not let him get away. Then a captain came out of the cabin and put a stop to it.
Leave him!
Then the captain took this Inuit down with him into his cabin.
There is a tent.
He told him to look over to the land where there are men living in a big tent. He said neither the Inuit nor any of his people must ever go there.
Understand? You must not go there. You must go. 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 Do not come here.
The Inuit was never told why some men were living separately in a forbidden camp. But in 1994, bone fragments discovered on King William Island suggested one chilling possibility. When anthropologist Anne Keenlyside tested the bones for lead poisoning, she also examined them under a powerful electron microscope.
We saw very distinct cut marks. These were quite different from animal tooth marks. These looked like very definite cut marks, as if they were made by some kind of a knife or metal blade.
Keenlyside then began plotting the pattern of cut marks on a skeleton.
A lot of the cuts were located in the vicinity of the joints, some of the bones that would have been covered by a lot of flesh or soft tissue. We also found cuts, interestingly, in the bones of the hands and feet. And the hands and feet are probably the most human aspects of the body apart from the face. And the fact that we were finding cuts in those locations suggested to me that perhaps these individuals were intentionally removing those more human aspects of the body. I think this evidence is strongly suggestive of cannibalism among these Franklin crew members. I don't see any other possible explanation that would account for those cut marks.
Keenly Side's tests collaborated the Inuit evidence, a century and a half old. The bones she tested were discovered in almost exactly the spot the Inuit described in the story of the Black Men. What became of these survivors is uncertain. Some years later, the Inuit reported finding an empty ship. Close by was some footprints, but nothing else. That appeared to be the end of the Franklin story. But for one last intriguing detail. In about 1851, an Inuit hunter found 4 white men half dead on the ice and sheltered them for the winter. When the spring came, they gave him an officer's sword as a gesture of thanks. It was made in 1835, the year James Fitzjames was made lieutenant.
Everyone believes we will make it through in a season, though I hope that we are forced to stay at least one winter in the ice.
When the Inuit found them, the men had been in the Arctic for 6 years. They were last seen heading for home. Piece by piece through the 1850s, news of the relics uncovered by the search parties made its way back to Britain. In 1859, with the discovery of the note on King William Island, the search was officially called off. When its details were disclosed, Lady Franklin learned she'd been a widow for more than a decade. But still, she demanded the search for an answer to the mystery go on.
What secrets may be hidden within those wrecked or stranded ships, we know not. What may be buried in the graves of our unhappy countrymen, or in caches not yet discovered, we have yet to learn. And thus left in ignorance and darkness, with so little obtained, can it be fitting to pronounce that the fate of the expedition has been ascertained?
For years, historians and scientists have searched for clues to the fate of the Franklin expedition. And at last, their evidence taken together offers a plausible answer to this enduring mystery. After sailing south through Peel Sound, Franklin's men became trapped in the ice off King William Island. They tried to walk south to food and safety, but at a camp en route were halted by lead poisoning and scurvy. Those who could made it back to the ships. 2 years later, a group of 30 men met the Inuit as they tried to reach help. They later died, one by one, as they walked along the south coast of the island. Then a last group of survivors were found living on a single ship, with some who'd resorted to cannibalism exiled to a camp on shore. Finally, the last 4 men, still trying to make it home after 6 years lost in the Arctic.
To actually get out and get help and reach any outpost of civilization, that's 600 miles to the nearest outpost. But they had few other options. I mean, it was either stay there or march out to help or send a party in some direction. They were off the edge of any map. More than anything else, you realize that Franklin's men were still alive while search parties were here in the Arctic looking for them in all the wrong places. And in reality, there really wasn't much they could have done or done differently that would have saved them. The decisions that mattered had already been made. There were too many men. None of them knew how to live off the land. But for these last survivors, the die is already cast.
The Franklin tragedy shocked Victorian society to the core. No fabled route across the Arctic could be worth the lives of 129 men. But one young boy, reading this story, was transfixed. And everything about this great British disaster inspired him to try and conquer the passage for himself.